Well, as the title suggests, time plays a role. And of course, that's something, if you write music, you can't not think of time. I mean, it seems like that's your medium. And in this piece, I like to make the point, which you could make about almost all music, is that music really is almost nothing but time, time and air. And in the way that I mean that is, okay, a piece unfolds over, 15 minutes. But within that, rhythms, phrase structure, those are all temporal too. But then the thing you don't tend to think of is that actually pitch itself is time. I mean, it's only about the number of vibrations per second gives you an A versus an E. And if you want to take that even one step farther, when you hear an oboe versus a piano, well, what makes that difference? I mean, it's a little more complicated than this. I'm oversimplifying, but essentially, it's about its overtones, and the overtones are actually just pitches above the fundamental, which are, again, really about how many vibrations per second. So really, in a way, music is almost like the very fabric of music is made out of time. So this is sort of a meditation. That, if you're asking my inspiration, sort of that as a starting point. You have sort of objective time, the time of a clock ticking, but then we all know we have how we experience time is very different depending on what's happening at the moment. And I think the interesting thing about music is it sort of shapes, while it unfolds in objective time, it shapes our experience of time. So that was my starting point too, to how to sort of shape the sort of psychological time, let's say. And so each movement deals with a different aspect of that. The first movement is called Fragmented time. And what it has is relatively short fragments of material from the other movements, so in a sense it's an introduction to that. Most films or television, I mean, the cuts are, but they can happen, what, one every 2 seconds, 3 seconds. I mean, and most of us take that as natural, and we form the continuities between. In music, that tends to not be the case. It's interesting that in the different worlds, there's sort of different aesthetics, and most things tend to have an idea, take minimalism that goes and sustain something. So this is about sort of mapping that idea of the quick cuts onto a musical gesture, with sort of the violin is sort of the conductor for it, because the violin starts with these repeated note passage, but then has these very aggressive chords that, in a sense, cut to the next section. So it both has this way of showing fragmented time, but at the same rate, in terms of the form of the whole piece, it's looking forward to many of the movements and the material we're going to hear following that. Almost the entire orchestra part comes from the violin line. So she plays this cantabile line, and the notes sort of spill out into the orchestra and are picked up at the beginning by harmonics in the strings. Later she plays a little figure that then sort of spreads out into the percussion and harp. So she engenders the whole texture, the whole fabric. And it's not unlike also some electronic techniques of, when you have artificial reverbs and so on, so it sort of uses that. The third movement is called compressed time, which she's gone on about how difficult and how hard she had to work. It sounds amazing hearing her play it. And that's sort of, the idea there is also, is there a difference between just a short piece, one can have a piece that's a minute, and the feeling of compressed time, so like the feeling that there's a 3 or 4 minute piece that's been squeezed into a minute. And so I want this movement to feel very sort of squeezed together, compressed. And that, in a way, follows up another piece I have, orchestra piece called Microsymph, which is basically a whole symphony, a big 50-minute symphony squeezed just into 10 minutes. So I'm sort of interested in that idea of how much one can portray that. The fourth movement is called overlapping time, and I suppose if you were to make the cinematic analog, what it is, it's many crossfades. So these sort of different temporal character worlds, one starts, gets louder, and then gradually subsides. But when that one's subsiding, the other one starts. So they're always dovetailed and overlapping, and you get these sort of interesting, ambiguous areas in between as the one is phase transitioning into the other. And the next movement is the fifth movement called Entropic time. And in terms of the arc of the whole 7 movements, this is probably the centerpiece, sort of the gravity. It's the most climactic movement. And here takes the idea of entropy, the movement from order to disorder. And it's maybe mostly presented in the opening theme, this very chiseled theme that's played unison at the beginning. But then as the piece goes on, it becomes more and more sort of broken apart until the very final section of the piece, we have just these little fragments that have sort of lost their rhythmic structure, their pitch structure, are all sort of coming dissembled. And in that sense, the formal sense too, it's that sort of break things apart and maybe sets the stage for the beginning of the end. So that's definitely sort of the central movement that way. And following that is a very short movement called backwards time. And what it basically plays on is, we've all heard probably records played backwards, right? And the effect is usually this envelope where we hear things that go, and that's because we don't notice it when we're hearing stuff forward, but that tends to be the way most instruments attack. That is, they attack with a sort of, there's an accent and then it sort of falls away, and when you reverse that, it becomes this sort of rush to the end of a note. So this piece uses that as its prime mode of articulation, and there are occasional little fragments too of previous movements. So in the sense that the first movement looked forward, this movement looks backwards to the other movements, and ushers in the last movement, which is called harmonic time, and is a long, essentially one long cantabile melody for violin, supported by orchestra. And it brings back this idea in terms of harmonic time of that, again, pitch is actually a function of time itself. So when we hear a chord that forms a pleasing combination of tones, it's because the relative vibrations between these various notes are in somehow sympathetic. And that, of course, that alludes to the old notion of, harmony of the spheres, in the sense of an ordered universe where there's sort of set proportion between various revolutions. So it, in a sense, obliquely refers to that too. There's nothing that unusual. Could point out a few things like at the end of the fifth movement, there's I doubt there are many duets between violin and flexitone. But I have this sort of gesture of violin playing with a jeté bow, sort of this glissando up, and it occurred to me that you could sort of, a flexitone, which, do you know flexitone? It's like this instrument with a piece of metal and these two balls that you shake, and then you change the pitch like that. So use that to mirror the violin. And so that sort of was fun to have that relationship. When you have a soloist, it sets up possibilities for that, of how does that soloist relate to the orchestra, right? And so in that movement, the fifth movement, there are also a number of cases where the violin plays a fragment that gets echoed in another instrument, and there's sort of a dialogue or a multitude of dialogues from that.